The beginning of a tragedy. The story begins in Arlington, Texas, a small but bustling suburban town where families seek security, and dreams are nurtured between barbecues and high school football games. But beneath the charm of this seemingly idyllic community lurks the stark contrast of ambition that chews right through its heart. Two families from opposite walks of life, their futures reluctantly tangled by greed, pride, and dangerous intent. On one side stood the Emerson family, synonymous with hard work and integrity. Jonathan Emerson, a self-made entrepreneur, had risen from a modest background to become a respected figure in town. With his wife Sarah and their 10-year-old son Ethan, Jonathan lived in a restored craftsman house, a symbol of his determination and relentless work ethic. To the people of Arlington, he was proof that even without powerful allies or inherited connections, the American dream was still alive. But to others, especially those who wished to exploit or control the market Jonathan operated in, he was an obstacle, too stubborn to buy into their schemes. On the other side of this narrative loomed the prestigious Cortez family whose name carried both influence and whispers of intimidation. Miranda Cortez, the wife of a powerful Texas state senator, was the type of woman who never entered a room unnoticed. Regal in appearance but ruthless in execution, she used her husband's name and her own cunning to maneuver in and manipulate the wealthy circles of Arlington. Miranda wasn't just a master of networking, she controlled people like pieces on a chessboard. To her, wealth wasn't a prize, it was leverage, and she hated anyone who stood in her way, no matter how righteous their claims were. The collision course was set when Jonathan, founder of Greenhaven Agriculture, a locally respected farming and sustainability startup, refused an overture from Miranda's orbit. One of her closely linked venture firms wanted to acquire a majority share in Jonathan's company, promising profit margins that could dazzle anyone with dollar signs in their eyes. But Jonathan wasn't chasing wealth for its own sake. Preserving his company meant protecting the values he cherished. To him, Greenhaven wasn't just a business. It was a commitment to ethical farming practices and sustainability. It was his family's legacy. The refusal, however polite and firm, sparked Miranda's ire. Though it seemed Jonathan's rejection had ended the matter, Miranda saw it differently. To her, being told no wasn't just a professional disappointment, it was a personal insult. No one dared to defy her. For someone whose word was practically law in many corporate boardrooms, Jonathan Emerson had become a problem, a stubborn thorn embedded in her side. From that moment she resolved to bend him to her will, no matter the cost. At first, the tension simmered quietly, hidden behind polite smiles in town events and minor business retaliation. But Arlington's small community was a fishbowl. Whispers quickly surfaced among the insiders about Miranda's growing disdain for Jonathan. People knew better than to openly discuss Miranda's affairs or methods. She had friends in law enforcement, local government, and beyond. Yet even Miranda's closest confidants couldn't have anticipated how dark her ambitions would become. For months, Miranda bided her time. With an intuitive sense of leverage, she dug into every crevice of Jonathan's life, his finances, his family, even the operations of his employees. She waited for weakness, a thread she could pull to unravel the tapestry of Jonathan's principles. And slowly but surely, she began to weave a plan so insidious that Arlington would never forget. Jonathan Emerson, a resolute entrepreneur. Jonathan Emerson didn't come from wealth, but what he lacked in privilege, he more than made up for with sheer determination and an unshakable moral compass. Born and raised in rural Oklahoma, Jonathan was the middle child in a family of 5 who struggled to get by. His father, an honest mechanic, spent long hours fixing farm equipment for their small-town neighbors, while his mother worked part-time as a school librarian. The Emersons were not unfamiliar with hardship, but they faced life's challenges head-on, instilling in Jonathan a work ethic that would define him for the rest of his life. From a young age, Jonathan displayed a sharp mind and a knack for problem-solving. While other kids in their tight-knit farming community scribbled football plays or doodled superheroes in their notebooks, Jonathan was sketching out wind turbines and devising ways to make their family garden more productive. His teachers took notice, encouraging him to aim higher, to seek opportunities that extended beyond the crop fields and grain silos surrounding their town. "This one's got a future," his math teacher once told his parents, nodding approvingly at one of Jonathan's handwritten charts analyzing soil nutrients for a class project. When Jonathan graduated as valedictorian of his high school, there was no doubt he was destined for bigger things. With a bundle of scholarships and an uncontainable drive, He became the first Emerson to go to college, majoring in environmental sciences at the University of Texas at Austin. He worked 2 part-time jobs to cover what his scholarships didn't, cleaning dorm rooms in the mornings and tutoring math in the evenings. While his peers spent weekends at fraternity parties or tailgating before football games, Jonathan could often be found in the school greenhouse, hands deep in soil, learning about crop sustainability and organic farming methods. It was during his time at Texas that his vision for Greenhaven agriculture began to take root in his mind. He saw 2 problems staring America in the face: the unchecked exploitation of natural resources and the declining profitability of family-run farms. What if we could do this differently? He often wondered. Not just to grow better crops, but to grow smarter with integrity. Years later, after internships at several research farms and a stint working for the USDA, Jonathan decided it was time to make his dream a reality. Using every dollar of his savings and a modest loan from a local bank, he launched Greenhaven Agriculture in Arlington, Texas, a startup focused on sustainable farming and organic produce. Jonathan prided himself on what his company stood for: high-quality, pesticide-free crops, eco-friendly practices, and fair treatment of both land and labor. In a world dominated by mega agribusinesses, Greenhaven was a small fish, but an inspiring one. Jonathan refused to compromise on his principles, even when larger competitors circled like sharks, attempting to push him out of the market. Greenhaven quickly earned a reputation for its uncompromising standards, and Jonathan became a notable figure within both the local agricultural community and the Texas business scene. Farmers admired him for his honesty and practical knowledge, while consumers trusted his company's products for their integrity. He cultivated an image that was refreshingly old-fashioned in principle, but modern in execution. Not everyone admired Jonathan's vision, however. His refusal to chase profits at the expense of ethics annoyed larger corporations who saw his philosophy as quaint and financially naive. More than one CEO tried to edge him out, offering lucrative buyouts that he resolutely turned down. "Greenhaven isn't for sale," Jonathan would respond time and again, his tone firm and his jaw set. "This company isn't just mine. It belongs to the people we serve and the earth we steward." Despite his unwavering professional focus, Jonathan's deepest motivation wasn't money or reputation, it was his family. Every decision he made, every risk he took, was rooted in his love for his wife, Sarah, and their 10-year-old son, Ethan. Jonathan's devotion to them was evident in all he did. He'd often rush home from long days at the farm to coach Ethan's little league baseball team, or help Sarah fix up their craftsman-style home, a labor of love that represented their shared commitment to the life they'd built together. Yet, beneath the successes and the accolades, Jonathan faced battles that others rarely saw. Running a sustainable business in an industry riddled with shortcuts and corruption wasn't easy, and he frequently found himself at odds with influential figures who resented his approach. Farmers who'd once been allies were tempted by the lucrative deals offered by competitors, and land developers pressed him to sell off portions of Greenhaven's property for commercial purposes. Through it all, Jonathan held steadfast. "You don't plant seeds today to see results overnight," he would remind himself whenever the weight of his choices felt too heavy. "You plant them for the harvest of tomorrow." To Arlington, Jonathan Emerson was a pillar of integrity, a reminder that doing the right thing could still lead to success. But his virtue was not without a cost. To individuals like Miranda Cortez, with immense power and a deep disdain for being told no, Jonathan became something else entirely. He was a roadblock, an irritant, a nail that demanded to be hammered down. As Miranda's schemes began to take shape, Jonathan had no idea how close he was to being pulled into a storm that would threaten everything he'd built, not just his company, but the family he cherished above all else. For all his wisdom and foresight, Jonathan's belief in the fundamental goodness of people left him vulnerable to those who lacked it. And the danger looming on the horizon would test the strength of his convictions in ways he could never have prepared for. Miranda Cortez, the calculating queen. Miranda Cortez was, in many ways, a figure cut straight from the pages of Machiavelli. She was ambitious, shrewd, and unflinching when it came to getting what she wanted. As the wife of Texas State Senator James Cortez, her presence and influence extended far beyond the confines of her husband's office. Miranda wasn't content to be a political trophy wife or a doting hostess for Senate fundraisers. That wasn't her style. No, Miranda wanted more, and she was willing to manipulate, destroy, and intimidate to secure her place at the top. Miranda grew up in the affluent neighborhood of Highland Park, Dallas. Her father was a high-powered corporate lawyer, and her mother a Southern debutante turned socialite. Miranda was their only child, raised to command attention. From a young age, she mastered the art of charming others, whether it was classmates, authority figures, or even her own parents. But beneath the polite smiles and pearls she wore as a teenager simmered a fierce, almost predatory ambition. Her rise to power truly began when she met James Cortez at an Ivy League alumni mixer in Boston during her final year at Wellesley College. James was already making waves as a young, charismatic lawyer with political aspirations. Miranda saw in him not just a husband but a vessel for her ambitions. He in turn was charmed by her wit, poise, and polished demeanor. The two married within a year, moving back to Texas where Miranda began to thrive in a political and social world that rewarded her ruthless cunning. But Miranda wasn't content staying in the shadow of her rising star husband. She viewed politics as a chessboard, her husband as a rook, and herself as the queen, putting all the pieces in motion. With her connections, charm, and intellect, she became the power behind James's career, ensuring that his political rivals never lasted long. She held private luncheons where alliances were forged under layers of pleasantries and mentorships that doubled as intimidation tactics. Her ability to gain trust, then use leverage against her enemies, was unmatched. She thought 2 steps ahead of everyone and rarely showed her hand until the game was already hers. While James spent his days debating legislation and shaking hands, Miranda carved her niche in corporate America, seeking influence in boardrooms, venture capital firms, and nonprofit organizations. She wasn't interested in CEO titles or public accolades. Miranda wanted something more covert but far more potent. She wanted control. Over the years, she forged a tight web of business alliances, becoming an unofficial fixer for the city's wealthy elite. Need a government permit expedited? Miranda could get it done before you even finished your coffee. Want a competitor's regulation fined into oblivion? One call from Miranda, and the gears of bureaucracy would grind them to a halt. But Miranda wasn't all polished surfaces. Beneath her designer outfits and southern charm was a ruthless practicality, a belief that most rules and morals were weaknesses invented for less clever people. She had no illusions about the cost of power and didn't mind occasionally dealing with Dallas's darker elements. Through alliances with off-the-books consultants, Miranda ensured that the Cortez name carried as much weight in the streets as it did in boardrooms, and given all the lengths she went to secure her dominance, losing was never an option. This particular drive to win at all costs made Miranda formidable but also dangerous to those who dared cross her. To her, saying no to one of her proposals wasn't just business, it was rebellion. And Miranda crushed rebels. She relished the chase, enjoyed identifying their weak spots, financial, personal, or emotional, and then waiting until she could seize the advantage. There was nothing Miranda hated more than someone standing in her way, particularly someone she deemed trivial, like Jonathan Emerson. Miranda had first heard of Jonathan through her circle of venture capitalists. Greenhaven Agriculture was small, sure, but the startup had begun making impressive profits by combining sustainable farming practices with high-quality organic produce. At first, Miranda had admired the business from a distance. She lured allies onto Jonathan's board of investors and began subtly steering her shadow network toward influencing him. What she didn't anticipate was Jonathan's integrity. He turned down every collaborative offer she put forward, even when the numbers were so enticing that others in their shoes would have jumped greedily. Miranda respected ambition, but she had no patience for morality, and Jonathan's stubborn refusal to sell made him intolerable in her eyes. "Who does he think he is?" she would spit to her inner circle over champagne at private receptions. "A small-town farmer pretending to be a tycoon. He won't just turn down my money, he acts like I'm beneath him. That kind of pride needs to be taught a lesson." And so, Miranda switched from subtle persuasion to outright warfare. First came the whispers, disparaging Jonathan's management style at social events. Then came the sabotage, anonymous complaints to regulators, followed by sudden issues with Greenhaven's supply chain that Miranda joyfully orchestrated. Still, Jonathan would not budge. For Miranda, this refusal was nothing short of an insult, not to her proposals but to her as a person. And if there was one thing she had never tolerated in her life, it was being underestimated. Though skilled in games of manipulation, Miranda had a sharp impulsivity about her, especially when scorned. She began pulling files from her network, diving into Jonathan's private life. His records, financial dealings, hiring practices, there wasn't a stone Miranda left unturned. She knew his wife Sarah, attractive, kind, but vulnerable, and she began sniffing for cracks she could exploit. Every human had a breaking point, and Miranda intended to find Jonathan's. But whether it came through his finances, his business, or even his family, Miranda didn't care. "Men like him shouldn't get to write the rules," she said coldly, pacing her lavish living room late one evening with her assistant nervous in the corner. Her tone was dripping with contempt. "They think that principles mean something in this world. All principles do is keep you poor, while those of us who act take everything we want." For months, Miranda plotted. She knew patience and precision were her greatest weapons. She waited for gaps, for opportunities, but as her schemes set in motion, Miranda's overconfidence blinded her to the unforeseen storms she was summoning. Her obsession with proving her superiority made her reckless. Her games grew darker and more personal, turning into a vendetta that not only put Jonathan at risk, but also began to threaten everything Miranda had built for herself. And yet, for all her power, Miranda Cortez failed to see one truth. The most dangerous predators are the ones who don't realize when they're being followed in the hunt. The clash of interests between two families. The conflict began quietly, almost imperceptibly, a faint hum of tension and misunderstanding between two people with vastly different ideas of how the world should work. In one corner there was Jonathan Emerson, principled, driven, and unshakable. In the other, Miranda Cortez, a master manipulator who thrived on control and conquest. While neither had originally sought to cross paths, fate, or perhaps Miranda's carefully calculated ambitions, had other plans. And what started as a silent tug-of-war over business ideals rapidly escalated into a full-blown battle where no rules applied. Jonathan Emerson's company, Greenhaven Agriculture, had been making waves in both the local market and beyond. It was a beacon of ethical business practices in a fiercely competitive industry. Greenhaven provided high-quality organic produce while championing sustainable farming. Still a small operation compared to the agricultural behemoths that dominated Texas markets, Greenhaven was growing, and its growth caught the wrong kind of attention. Miranda Cortez was no stranger to spotting opportunity. She knew how to read the chessboard of business and politics better than anyone. She had the kind of wealth and influence that could either elevate or crush a business like Greenhaven if she so chose. When one of her venture capital influencers brought Greenhaven to her attention during a private cocktail event, Miranda immediately saw it for what it was: a diamond in the rough, a business ripe for acquisition, monetization, and eventually monopolization. All Miranda needed was a way to worm her way in. The first move came in the form of a well-connected representative from one of Miranda's shell venture firms offering Jonathan a lucrative deal to sell controlling interest in his company. "We'd like to take Greenhaven to the next level," the representative had said, dressed sharply in a tailored suit as he sipped espresso across the table from Jonathan during a downtown meeting in Dallas. "With our resources and your expertise, we can turn this into something bigger than you've ever imagined." Jonathan, while polite, was immediately skeptical. Though money wasn't unimportant in the agricultural world, it took capital to make change happen. Greenhaven had never been about expansion at all costs. Its mission, rooted in sustainability and values, wasn't something Jonathan was willing to pawn off for profit. "I appreciate the interest," Jonathan replied, his tone measured but firm, "but Greenhaven's not for sale. This company stands for something and I intend to keep it that way." The rejection was relayed almost word for word up the chain of Miranda's network, until it finally reached her ears. And that was when the clash of interests between the Emersons and the Cortezes truly began. Anyone else might have taken Jonathan's rejection as the end of the conversation, chalking it up to principles and walking away. But not Miranda. To her, a no wasn't a setback. It was a personal challenge, and Miranda Cortez didn't lose. If Jonathan wanted to play the part of the stubborn idealist, then Miranda was determined to show him what happened when his kind held out against her. She would make him see that in her world, virtues meant nothing against the crushing force of power. Miranda's opening salvo was subtle, almost unnoticeable. Local permits for Greenhaven's expansion suddenly became delayed, caught up in unnecessarily long review processes controlled by Miranda's connections in local government. Then came the sudden drop-offs in Greenhaven's regular supply chain. The trucking companies Jonathan worked with were mysteriously overbooked or unable to deliver on time. A couple of key suppliers dropped out entirely, citing vague, better opportunities without ever going into specifics. Jonathan, unused to these kinds of underhanded tactics, started to grow wary, though he made no moves to retaliate. "We'll get through this," he reassured Sarah one evening as they sat at their kitchen table after a particularly stressful day. Ethan was upstairs in bed, and Sarah had noticed the heavy lines of exhaustion beginning to crease her husband's forehead. Sudden challenges are just part of running a business. This kind of thing happens all the time. But it was more than just bad luck. And soon, Jonathan started piecing together the connections. Whispers in Arlington business circles confirmed his suspicions. Miranda Cortez had set her sights on Greenhaven and wasn't taking no for an answer. People who'd worked or dealt with Miranda before offered him quiet warnings over hush-hush business luncheons. "You're dealing with someone who doesn't believe in taking prisoners," one longtime associate once said. "She doesn't just beat you, she breaks you so no one else ever thinks to try." The warnings weren't just hyperbole. Miranda's influence seeped everywhere. City zoning boards, agricultural associations, even Jonathan's own investors, some of whom were subtly nudged by Miranda's network to push him toward reconsidering her offers. Jonathan responded the only way he knew how, with patience, resilience, and a firm resolve to stay the course. But Miranda didn't see his resistance as strength. To her, it was an insult. And as the days stretched into weeks and months, her ire only deepened. What could have been a mere business disagreement started to feel like an all-out war. For Miranda, the clash wasn't just about acquiring Greenhaven anymore. It was about crushing Jonathan Emerson personally. She wanted to humiliate him, to make him regret ever standing up to her. Perhaps deep down, she even wanted to remind herself that no one, no matter how noble their intentions, could ever truly stand against the kind of power she wielded. For Jonathan, the conflict became an unspoken test of his deeply held principles. He had built Greenhaven to represent everything he valued, not just as a businessman, but as a father and husband. Yielding to Miranda would have been easier, less stressful, and far more profitable, but it would have meant compromising the ideals that guided him. And for Jonathan, accepting defeat simply wasn't an option. The Emersons and the Cortezes stood at opposite ends of the battlefield, two families seemingly worlds apart yet drawn together by this escalating clash of interests. It started behind closed doors with whispers in boardrooms and contracts left unsigned. But as Miranda's tactics became bolder and Jonathan's defenses grew firmer, the battle began spilling into the public eye. In Arlington, speculation ran rampant. Why had Miranda Cortez taken such an interest in a small-time agricultural startup? And how far was she willing to go to get what she wanted? The answers would prove far more chilling than anyone could have predicted. Jonathan framed and entangled in legal battles. The sun had just begun to rise over Arlington, painting the sky with soft hues of orange and pink, when two black SUVs pulled into the driveway of Jonathan Emerson's craftsman-style home. The morning calm was shattered by the sharp knock of law enforcement at the front door. Jonathan, still dressed in the old flannel shirt he wore for early morning farm runs, opened the door to find three agents standing in crisp suits, their badges gleaming. Behind them, another officer held a clipboard bearing a search warrant. "Mr. Emerson," the lead agent began, his voice as sharp and cold as a winter breeze, "we're here on behalf of the IRS and the Department of Justice. We have reasons to believe Greenhaven Agriculture has committed tax evasion and financial fraud. We'll need to search the premises immediately." Jonathan froze. For a moment, it felt as though the air was sucked from the room. "Tax evasion, financial fraud?" he repeated, his voice edged with astonishment. "There must be some kind of mistake. Greenhaven's books are clean. We run audits ourselves every quarter. You've got the wrong person." The agents' faces didn't flinch. "We'd recommend you cooperate," came the curt reply. "If this is a mistake, the truth will come to light. But for now, we're also confiscating all electronic devices, files, and financial records related to your business. Resistance would only make things worse." Jonathan's wife, Sarah, appeared behind him, her face pale as she gripped the arm of his flannel. "What's happening, Jonathan?" she whispered, her voice trembling. 10-year-old Ethan watched silently from the top of the staircase, his small knuckles gripping the railing. There was no time to process the chaos. In a matter of hours, the Emerson home and the Greenhaven office were swarmed by law enforcement, their personal and professional lives turned upside down. Financial records were boxed up, computers carted away, and employees questioned. For Jonathan, the humiliation stung almost as much as the frustration. Neighbors in Arlington watched curiously from their windows as armed agents combed through their backyard gardens and the Greenhaven trucks parked beside the house. The allegations were as serious as they were unexpected. Jonathan stood accused of falsifying financial documents and hiding millions of dollars in taxable income, charges that, if proven true, could result in prison time and the collapse of everything he had worked so hard to build. In the face of such accusations, Jonathan's unwavering integrity became his shield. But even he couldn't deny the cleverness of this trap. By the end of the day, official charges were filed, and the Emerson name was plastered across local news outlets. Headlines ranged from "Local Entrepreneur Under IRS Investigation" to "Greenhaven's Dirty Secrets, Emerson Faces Fraud Allegations." For someone whose reputation had been built on trust and hard work, Jonathan suddenly found himself vilified by strangers and acquaintances alike. "What is this, Jonathan?" Sarah asked late that night as they sat in silence at the kitchen table, the tension palpable. Her voice cracked as she tried to hold back tears. "Who could do this to us? Everyone knows you'd never—" She trailed off, hands shaking as she gripped a mug of untouched tea. Jonathan ran a hand over his face, his head pounding from the sheer weight of it all. "I don't know, Sarah," he muttered, his voice low, "but I do know this. Somebody's gone to a lot of trouble to make it look like I've done something wrong, and I've got a pretty good idea of where this is coming from." It didn't take him long to figure out who was behind the scheme: Miranda Cortez. Her fingerprints weren't physically there, of course. Miranda was far too savvy to leave a trail tied directly to her name, but the sudden emergence of fabricated evidence, the anonymous whistleblower claiming insider knowledge of Greenhaven's finances, and the conveniently timed leaks to the local press? It fit her MO perfectly. To Miranda, destroying Jonathan wasn't just about business anymore, it was personal. Jonathan remembered the whispered warnings he'd received months prior, from business partners who knew more about Miranda's ways than they dared to admit. "She doesn't come after you with a gun. She doesn't need to," one acquaintance had said. "She has lawyers, accountants, and politicians in her pocket. They'll bleed you dry so no one even notices you're dead until you're gone." As Jonathan reviewed the charges against him with his lawyer days later, he struggled to recognize the figure the financial reports painted. The allegations were damning: intentionally undervalued assets, falsified tax filings, hidden offshore accounts he'd never even heard of. "This isn't just a misunderstanding," his lawyer told him grimly. "Whoever orchestrated this wants to bury you, Jonathan. This isn't about taxes. It's about destroying your credibility before you even have a chance to fight back." Meanwhile, Miranda remained untouchable, her involvement cloaked in plausible deniability. Seated in her lavish Dallas estate, she reveled in how perfectly her plan was unfolding. "Do you see what that stubborn fool gets for crossing me?" she sneered to her inner circle over a glass of wine. "This isn't just about his company, it's about making sure Jonathan Emerson's name becomes something no one wants to be associated with." The legal battles soon became an all-consuming nightmare. Jonathan was forced to spend countless hours with legal teams, poring over forged records he'd never seen, pleading his case to skeptical officials, and trying to keep Greenhaven from going under. Investors began backing out, suppliers grew wary, and within weeks the small-town hero's empire seemed poised to crumble under the weight of suspicion. But Miranda had overlooked one essential characteristic of Jonathan: his refusal to back down. Even under immense pressure, Jonathan wasn't the kind of man to cower. "We keep fighting," he told Sarah one evening. "If Miranda thinks she can intimidate me into giving up, on my business, on everything we've built, she doesn't know who she's dealing with." The road ahead was daunting. Jonathan would have to clear his name, prove his innocence, and stop Miranda from sinking Greenhaven entirely. But as he sat in the dim glow of his kitchen, watching Sarah quietly put Ethan to bed, a fire lit inside him. Miranda may have underestimated Jonathan Emerson, but he wasn't going down without a fight. As dark as the days ahead seemed, there was one truth Jonathan knew deep in his heart. The only thing harder than planting seeds in barren soil was watching them grow through the storms. And like every other challenge in his life, he intended to weather this one, whatever the cost. The plea of a desperate wife. Sarah Emerson had always been the quiet strength of her family. She wasn't the kind of woman who sought the spotlight, not in the public eye or in social circles. Her world revolved around her family, Jonathan and Ethan. To her, the hectic world outside their craftsman-style home was background noise, a distant concern over which she had little influence. But now, that world was closing in fast, and for the first time in her life, Sarah felt powerless to protect the people she loved most. The house felt eerily quiet now. Jonathan's legal battles had drained the once vibrant energy out of their home, leaving only signs of stress in its wake: unfinished meals sitting in the kitchen, unopened mail piled high on the entryway table, and a husband whose face, once alight with hope, was now marked with exhaustion and lines of worry. Ethan, their 10-year-old son, had stopped asking why Daddy wasn't at his baseball games anymore. The boy had quickly learned that this wasn't something anyone could explain. But one thing was clear to Sarah: they were losing. Jonathan's reputation had been dragged through the mud, Greenhaven agriculture was on the brink of total collapse, and their savings had been eaten away by endless legal fees. The foundation upon which they had built their lives, a foundation Jonathan had worked so hard to create, was crumbling. And Sarah couldn't stand idly by any longer. That's how she found herself clutching her phone late one night, scrolling through her contacts, heart racing. Her hands shook as she deleted the draft of her text message for the third time and started over. Her pride made her hesitate, but pride didn't matter anymore. What mattered was saving her family. She needed a lifeline. As unlikely as it seemed, it came in the form of Miranda Cortez. It wasn't an easy decision. Sarah had heard enough whispers around Arlington to know Miranda's reputation, but she didn't have Jonathan's inherent toughness to weather a prolonged war. That final contact, the one she never thought she would have to call, lingered there on her screen. Miranda C. "I can't believe I'm even considering this," she whispered to herself. Her voice trembled in the dim glow of the screen as though speaking it aloud would somehow make the decision irreversible. But the image of Ethan sleeping upstairs, curled around the teddy bear he'd had since he was a toddler, kept her from putting the phone down. And so, despite a gnawing guilt pressing down on her chest, she dialed the number. The conversation that followed was one of the hardest of Sarah's life. Miranda answered with her usual silk and steel voice as though she'd been expecting the call all along. "Sarah," Miranda said warmly, though there was an unmistakable sharpness underneath. "What a surprise! To what do I owe the pleasure?" At first, Sarah's words refused to form, her voice cracked, and for a moment she considered hanging up right then and there, but Miranda, ever perceptive, seized the silence. "Is everything all right, dear? You sound upset," Miranda added, a deliberately softened tone masking the calculated mind behind it. Sarah took a deep, trembling breath. "Mrs. Cortez," she began formally, her hands clutching the phone as if it were a lifeline. I wanted to speak with you. It's about Jonathan, about the situation we're in." There was a brief pause, but Sarah could feel the invisible smile spreading across Miranda's face through the silence. "Of course," Miranda replied, her politeness almost unnerving. "Why don't we meet in person? These things are always better discussed face to face. Tomorrow, my estate around noon?" Sarah hesitated but eventually agreed. She hung up, feeling as though she'd made some unspeakable deal with the devil. The following day, Sarah drove up to Miranda's sprawling Dallas estate, feeling like an ant approaching a lion's den. The yard was pristine, the flower beds perfectly manicured, and the fountain in the circular driveway seemed to sparkle in the midday sun. Everything about Miranda's home screamed power and influence, a stark contrast to the modest craftsman home that Sarah and Jonathan had fought so hard to keep. A housemaid led Sarah into the sitting room where Miranda waited, seated gracefully on a velvet armchair. She rose to greet Sarah, her smile as charming as it was predatory. "Sarah, thank you for coming," she said, gesturing for her guest to sit. "You must be under so much stress." Miranda leaned in slightly, resting her chin on her intertwined fingers. "I understand how hard this must be for you, for your family. Being in the public eye like this, facing such scrutiny, it's a shame really." Her words were laced with feigned sympathy, each syllable meant to draw Sarah deeper into her web. "Mrs. Cortez," Sarah began, determined to keep her voice steady. "I don't know what's going on behind the scenes or how this all started, but my family is falling apart, my husband is being destroyed, and I don't know what to do." Miranda's lips twitched almost imperceptibly. "Sarah, it's brave of you to come here," she said, her voice honey-sweet. "I can see how much you care for Jonathan and your son. You're a good wife, a good mother, but as you said, this situation is complicated. Unfortunately, these things don't just disappear overnight. They take resources, influence, shall we say." "Yes!" Sarah cut in, desperate now. "And I know you have those things. Please, if there's anything you can do to help Jonathan, I'm begging you. I'll do whatever you need." That was all Miranda had been waiting for. Her eyes sparkled with triumph as she leaned back in her chair, thoroughly enjoying the sight of Sarah folding under the pressure. "Anything?" The word hung in the air like a loaded question. Sarah's heart pounded. "Anything," she whispered, lowering her eyes. Miranda's smile widened, and she stood, pacing slowly around the room as she spoke. "Well, Sarah, there are ways to make problems disappear, but it doesn't come cheap. Influence, power, these things have their price. Let me be honest with you, to fix your husband's mess, I'll need a contribution, a substantial one, let's say $500,000. Sarah's head snapped up, her face paling. $500,000? We don't have that kind of money." Miranda sighed theatrically as though disappointed. "That's unfortunate," she responded coolly. "But surely there's something you can do. Some assets you could sell, loans you could take. Where there's a will, there's always a way." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. She felt trapped, like a bird ensnared in a hunter's net. She wanted to scream, to tell Miranda to go to hell, but the thought of Jonathan losing everything kept her rooted in her seat. "You think about it," Miranda added, brushing invisible dust off her skirt, "but don't take too long. After all, time isn't on Jonathan's side, is it?" As Sarah left the Cortez estate and drove back home, tears blurred her vision. She had gone in search of salvation, but all she'd found was another impossible weight to place on her family. Her mind raced with questions. How could she raise the money? What would happen if she didn't? For the first time, Sarah realized just how cruel Miranda Cortez truly was. This wasn't mere business for her, it was a game, and the stakes were Sarah's entire life. And as much as Sarah hated to admit it, Miranda wasn't just winning, she was dominating. The ruthless plan unfolds. Miranda Cortez sat quietly in her grand but dimly lit study, the glow of a crackling fire casting long shadows against the mahogany-paneled walls. A crystal glass of brandy rested untouched on the desk beside her as she flipped through a meticulously organized dossier. The room smelled faintly of sandalwood and power, a fitting backdrop for someone planning the complete and utter destruction of another human being. The folder contained every detail of Jonathan Emerson's life, the accounts of his business struggles, the names of his team, the layout of his home, and even the schedule of his 10-year-old son, Ethan. It was a life laid bare for Miranda's examination, presented to her by one of her many loyal consultants, as she liked to call her hired fixers. Miranda held her chin thoughtfully as she scanned through the pages. This wasn't a matter of simply eliminating a business rival anymore. No, this was personal. Jonathan's repeated refusals to sell Greenhaven, his quiet conviction, his stubborn unwillingness to bend, that had turned him into an object of obsession for Miranda. To her, Jonathan was an anomaly, a glitch in the system she controlled so meticulously. People didn't defy her, not for long, and yet here he was, resilient, principled, and worse yet, publicly admired. Miranda couldn't abide the notion that someone like him could walk away unscathed after denying her. But Miranda wasn't one to make reckless moves. Every action, no matter how heinous, was calculated, deliberate, and executed with precision. Destroying Jonathan wouldn't simply require legal battles and financial sabotage. The attacks needed to be sharper, quieter, and personal enough to ensure he never recovered. Consulting the fixers. "Royce!" Miranda called sharply without looking up from her papers. A man stepped into the study, his tall frame casting a sharp shadow across the room. Royce was Miranda's go-to fixer, a man with no moral compass and a Rolodex of connections that reached the darkest corners of society. He was clean-cut, emotionless, and as efficient as a scalpel. "Yes, Mrs. Cortez," Royce replied, his voice clipped and professional. Miranda leaned back in her armchair and gestured toward the folder sitting open on her desk. "We'll need to take things a step further. The usual disruptions, legal pressure, permit delays, they've proven annoyingly ineffective against Mr. Emerson. It's time to guarantee he can't rise above this. And I want to include his family in the calculation." Royce's expression didn't change. He was long past the point of being shocked by Miranda's requests. "Do you have a preference for the method, ma'am?" Miranda tapped her flawlessly manicured nails against the desk in a slow rhythm, as if already savoring the plan she was forming. "We'll start small. The financial fraud allegations are moving along nicely, but let's amplify the pressure. Leak some additional reports to the press, perhaps something salacious, affairs, gambling debts, maybe ties to extremist organizations, whatever makes him untouchable in both Arlington and the business world. Discredit him completely." Royce nodded and took mental notes, but Miranda wasn't finished. Her eyes narrowed, the firelight reflecting in her gaze like flickers of malice. "That won't be enough," she continued. "Jonathan Emerson has too much pride. For someone like him, ruining his reputation won't just suffice. He needs to see everything he loves, his business, his home, his family, burned to the ground." Royce tilted his head ever so slightly, his version of curiosity. "And how do you intend to accomplish that, Mrs. Cortez?" A sinister smile spread across Miranda's face, cold and razor-sharp. "You'll reach out to our contacts in Dallas, quietly, arrange for someone to handle matters more intimately." She gestured vaguely, but the insinuation was clear. Royce didn't flinch, but he hesitated for a brief moment, a rare crack in his composed demeanor. "You're suggesting physical threats?" he asked carefully. "Or something permanent?" Miranda considered the question for a moment, her fingers steepled in front of her. We'll see how far Emerson will bend before he breaks. Start with threats. Target his son Ethan. Nothing overt yet, something subtle but pointed, a scare at school perhaps. An unmarked envelope slipped inside Sarah's car with photographs of her daily routine. Make them feel vulnerable, hunted. Her tone was disturbingly calm, clinical, as though she were discussing a corporate acquisition, not orchestrating the torment of an innocent family. And if he still resists? Royce pressed, noting she hadn't ruled out the darker option. Miranda's expression hardened, the predatory smile fading into something colder, deadlier. If Jonathan doesn't fold by then, well, accidents happen every day, don't they? Her voice was almost a whisper, but the threat beneath it was deafening, pulling the strings. It didn't take long for her plan to take root. Within days, Jonathan's life began to unravel even further. Another anonymous whistleblower came forward with evidence that Greenhaven's financial fraud extended beyond tax evasion, implicating Jonathan in money laundering schemes that existed only in Miranda's twisted imagination. Bank accounts were frozen, suppliers pulled out, and investors dropped their remaining support. News articles painted Jonathan as not just a failed entrepreneur, but a criminal mastermind. At the same time, Sarah began to notice strange occurrences. A black SUV idling a few houses down from theirs for hours at a time, or an envelope left on their windshield containing photographs of Ethan walking home from school. Each image was paired with a single line typed starkly in red ink. You can't protect him. Jonathan, who was already drowning in legal trouble, didn't initially notice Sarah's mounting fear. She tried to keep it from him, holding in her sobs late at night in their bathroom, but the signs of stress began to show in her trembling hands and hollow eyes. Even Ethan seemed to sense the growing tension. He had started double-locking his bedroom door at night. Despite all this, Jonathan refused to back down. Miranda, however, had anticipated this. Her plan was never dependent on his immediate surrender. It was designed to break him over time, to grind him into dust so thoroughly that by the end, there was nothing left to fight for. And if things escalated to the point of no return? Miranda wasn't above pressing the final, irreversible button, a dangerous escalation. As Royce walked out of Miranda's study that night, the details of her plan playing in his mind, he hesitated briefly in the corridor. What she was asking for wasn't unprecedented, not in Miranda's circles, but it was more personal, more vicious than her usual schemes. This wasn't about power anymore, it was about inflicting pain. Is it necessary to go this far? He murmured quietly to himself, but he knew the answer. To Miranda Cortez, there was no such thing as too far. A dramatic abduction. The air over Dallas was thick and oppressive, the kind of summer night that clings to the skin and fills the lungs with heat. Faint sounds of traffic from Interstate 30 hummed in the distance, mingling with the occasional bark of a dog in one of the city's more affluent suburbs. To anyone driving by, the area looked peaceful, safe, a quiet oasis far from the chaos of urban life. But beneath the veneer of tranquility, something sinister was in motion, an orchestration of fear and violence that would soon shatter this stillness. Jonathan Emerson had no idea that tonight his world would change forever. The setup. It had been a long day for Jonathan. The legal investigations, the stress on his business, and the constant media scrutiny were taking their toll. It showed in his eyes, bloodshot and weary, as he parked his truck in front of their Arlington home. Ethically grown vegetables from the farm filled the back of the truck, their freshness a cruel reminder of the business he'd built, but now seemed to be slipping through his fingers. Inside, Sarah was trying to keep the routines going for Ethan's sake. Dinner plates sat half-cleared on the table, and the TV in the living room murmured friendly voices from a rerun of some animated series. Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch, still clutching his worn teddy bear. It was the kind of evening families like theirs cherished, a rare moment of calm in an increasingly stormy life. Jonathan leaned against the doorway, watching his son sleep, his heart aching with guilt for the disruption their once peaceful lives were enduring. I feel like the walls are closing in, Jonathan whispered to Sarah as he collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table. His voice was low, almost hoarse. I don't know how much longer we can keep this up. Sarah nodded, absent-mindedly rinsing dishes at the sink. Her hands were shaking, though she couldn't let Jonathan see it. She had noticed the black SUV parked 2 houses down again. It wasn't the first time she'd seen it, and her instincts screamed at her that something wasn't right. But what she couldn't have known, what none of them could have known, was that tonight they were not being watched passively. Tonight, Miranda Cortez had escalated her campaign. The ambush. It was well after midnight when the first sound broke the silence, a faint, almost imperceptible shuffle outside the Emersons' front door. The family was asleep. Jonathan had finally succumbed to exhaustion, crashing on the armchair in the corner of the living room, while Sarah and Ethan were upstairs. The house was bathed in quiet darkness, with only the soft hum of the air conditioning breaking the stillness. They never heard the lock being picked. They never noticed the brief flash of red from a laser sight scanning the interior. All they heard was the sudden loud crash of their front door being kicked in, followed by heavy footsteps storming into the house. Jonathan bolted awake, his heart racing. Before he could even comprehend what was happening, two masked men in all black wrestled him to the floor. One of them jabbed a knee into Jonathan's back, pinning him as he tried to shout for Sarah, but a gloved hand clamped painfully over his mouth. "Not a sound," one of the men growled, his voice distorted by a voice modulator. Upstairs, Ethan was jolted awake by the commotion. Confused and panicked, he stumbled to his feet, clutching his teddy bear as Sarah pulled him from his room. "Stay close to me, baby," she whispered, her voice trembling, as they crept toward the stairway. But before they could even make it to the top step, another masked figure appeared at the bottom of the stairs. His silhouette loomed large in the dim light, blocking their only escape route. "Move!" the man ordered, pointing up at them with what looked like the barrel of a weapon. Sarah froze, clutching Ethan so tightly he whimpered. "No!" she gasped, shaking her head. "Please, please, don't hurt him!" The man stepped forward, his tone cold and unyielding. "We're not here to hurt him, unless you make us." Downstairs, Jonathan was struggling against his captors, his muffled cries growing more desperate as he heard Ethan's voice echo from above. "Don't touch them!" he shouted, but it came out as a garbled roar through the hand over his face. The second man cocked his head, almost amused by Jonathan's resistance. Then he pulled out a phone and held it up, showing the screen to Jonathan. It displayed a live video feed of Sarah and Ethan trapped at the top of the stairs. "Cooperate," the man said, "or we pick the kid first." Jonathan froze. His breathing became shallow, his muscles tensed, and every ounce of fight left his body. "Take me," he spat. "Leave my family out of this." The capture. The abductors moved with methodical precision, scooping up their targets without leaving so much as a fingerprint behind. One of the men tied Jonathan's wrists behind his back with zip ties, dragging him out through the shattered door and into the back of a waiting black van. Another forced Sarah and Ethan downstairs, keeping a firm grip on Sarah's arm while the child sobbed into her side. "We only need him," the leader motioned toward Jonathan, tossing him into the van. "Leave the woman and the kid. Let them stew in it." "No, please!" Sarah screamed, her voice cracking as she lunged forward. She was quickly shoved back just as another man grabbed Ethan's arm and dragged the boy outside. Jonathan's eyes widened as he saw Ethan being pulled toward the van. "You said you weren't taking them! Don't you dare touch my son!" he roared, straining futilely against the constraints. "Oh, plans have changed," one of the men sneered. They stuffed Ethan into the van beside his father, despite Sarah's shrieking protests. Before speeding off into the night, the remaining abductor leaned in close to Sarah, his breath warm and menacing. "If you call the cops, you'll only find bodies. Understand?" Before she could even answer, the van roared down the street, taillights vanishing into the inky darkness as Sarah collapsed into the driveway, screaming her husband's and son's names into the silence. Vanishing into the night. Jonathan and Ethan were gone. The abduction took all of 8 minutes, fast, precise, and devastating. Sarah sat trembling on the front lawn as neighbors began peeking through their windows, curious but hesitant to step outside. Her mouth was dry, her legs shaky, and her mind straining to process the horror that had just unfolded. This wasn't just an escalation, it was war. Miranda Cortez had gone beyond sabotage, beyond courtroom battles, beyond intimidation. She had crossed the line into something darker, more sinister, and Sarah was left alone, powerless to stop it. A thrilling investigation journey. The night Jonathan Emerson and his son Ethan vanished in the clutches of their masked abductors, an invisible line crossed in Arlington, Texas. What had started as secretive legal sabotage and a cold war of power had erupted into a brazen act of violence that sent shockwaves through both the Emerson home and the entire community. For Sarah Emerson, the suffocating stillness of her home in the hours after the abduction became unbearable, a gnawing, haunting silence that mocked her inability to stop what had happened. But Sarah wasn't the kind of woman to crumble, not when Ethan was somewhere out there, terrified, and Jonathan, her husband, her rock, was being used as a pawn in Miranda Cortez's game of control, Fueled by desperation, love, and the faint glimmer of hope that they could still be saved, Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't rest until she found them. The call for help. At 3:47 a.m., Sarah sat at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold beside her trembling hands. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was her best friend and confidant, Lisa Harrington, an old college buddy who, years ago, had traded her accounting degree for a badge. Lisa was now an FBI investigator specializing in organized crime. "Sarah," Lisa's voice was sharp, but layered with concern. "I just saw the news. What the hell happened? Are you okay?" "I'm not okay," Sarah replied, her voice cracking, fighting back tears. "They took him, Lisa. They took Jonathan and Ethan. They just took them." There was a pause on the line before Sarah heard Lisa's professional instincts fully kick in. "Start from the beginning," Lisa instructed gently but firmly. "Every detail, no matter how small." Sarah recounted the night's events, her voice growing steadier as she relived the horrors of the abduction. The black van, the masked men, the threats, the way Jonathan had looked at her with pleading eyes as he was dragged away. "Did they leave anything? Any notes or messages?" Lisa asked. Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting to the envelope she'd earlier spotted on the windshield of her car. She had been too overwhelmed to open it, leaving it in the entryway. "There's an envelope," Sarah said. "Don't touch it," Lisa ordered immediately. "I'll send a team to secure it. This is bigger than the Arlington Police Department. They don't have the resources to handle this. Let me activate a federal investigation. If what you're telling me is connected to Miranda Cortez, this is about more than Jonathan or Greenhaven." The evidence begins to unfold within hours. The Emerson home transformed into a hub of investigative activity. FBI agents in dark suits and gloves scoured every corner of the property, while a forensics team delicately examined the envelope left behind. Sarah paced restlessly, clutching her phone as she waited for updates. Standing in the same space where her family had once been whole, she felt sickened by the quiet chaos of the investigation. Lisa arrived at dawn, stepping swiftly into the house with a mix of authority and familiarity. She pulled Sarah into a brief but reassuring hug. "We're going to get them back," Lisa promised. Although her expression was calm, her eyes betrayed a fierce determination that gave Sarah the smallest flicker of hope. "What was in the envelope?" Sarah asked anxiously. Lisa frowned as she opened her tablet and displayed an image of its contents, a single black-and-white photo of Ethan, clearly taken without his knowledge as he walked home from school weeks earlier. On the back, written in stark red ink, were the words, "Tick-tock, Mrs. Emerson." "They've been planning this for a while," Lisa muttered grimly. "This isn't random. The fact that they targeted your son alongside Jonathan speaks volumes. It's calculated. They don't just want Jonathan, they want to destroy him." Sarah's knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of the kitchen counter for support. "Miranda," she whispered. "It's her. I know it's her." Lisa nodded. "We're already looking into her network, but Miranda is careful. She never gets her hands dirty. If she's behind this, then she probably hired professionals to carry it out. That's who we need to find first." Following the trail. The search began with the obvious: security cameras, traffic monitors, and witness interviews. Agents combed through hours of footage from cameras near the Emerson home, gas stations, and main streets. Finally, a critical breakthrough arrived. A traffic camera 20 miles outside of Arlington captured a black van matching Sarah's description, heading west on Interstate 20. The van had no visible plates, but the FBI flagged it and began tracing possible routes. Meanwhile, Sarah insisted on helping the investigation in any way she could. She worked tirelessly alongside Lisa, going through emails, receipts, and Jonathan's business files for anything that might point to why Miranda had escalated her attacks to such an extreme. "There has to be a reason," Sarah said one evening, her eyes bloodshot as she scrolled through Jonathan's calendar on his laptop. "She's already destroyed his reputation, isn't that enough?" Lisa gave her a knowing look. "People like Miranda don't stop when they win. They stop when there's nothing left of their enemy. For her, this isn't about the business anymore. It's about control." Lisa's words solidified Sarah's resolve. "Then we don't let her win." A crack in the facade. A pivotal break came 3 days into the investigation. A freelance journalist working for a local paper approached the FBI with leaked information. He claimed that his source, an off-the-books contractor regularly employed by Miranda Cortez, had admitted to arranging Jonathan's kidnapping in exchange for a substantial payout. The journalist, who feared for his life, handed over recordings of his conversations with the contractor, including detailed descriptions of the abduction plan. The contractor's name was Roy Callahan, and he was no stranger to law enforcement. Callahan had been linked to organized crime for years, but had always evaded conviction. Armed with this new evidence, Lisa and her team tracked Callahan's known associates, surveillance patterns, and financial transfers. The deeper they dug, the more strings they found connecting him to Miranda's shadowy operations. Closing in the investigation became a race against time. Days stretched into sleepless nights as Sarah's anxiety deepened. Each hour without word from Jonathan or Ethan felt like a lifetime. But then, a coded message intercepted from one of Callahan's burner phones gave the FBI their big break: the location of an abandoned warehouse just outside of Fort Worth. "This is it," Lisa said, adrenaline coursing through her veins as her team finalized plans for a tactical raid. Sarah lingered nearby, clinging to the hope that her family was alive. "Stay here, Sarah," Lisa said firmly, gripping Sarah's shoulders. "Let us handle this." "No," Sarah replied, her voice trembling but resolute. "I need to be there. If they're scared, they'll need to see me." Lisa hesitated but finally agreed. "Stay in the van until we secure the area. Promise me." The warehouse. At dawn, armored FBI vehicles surrounded the abandoned warehouse. Through binoculars, agents spotted 2 armed men patrolling the perimeter. The tactical team moved swiftly, breaching the doors in seconds with flashbangs and precision. The sound of gunfire erupted, followed by the shouts of agents securing the building. Lisa's voice crackled over a radio. "We have Jonathan and Ethan! Repeat, we found them!" Moments later, Sarah sprinted from the van toward the warehouse. She could barely see through her tears as Jonathan stumbled out, bruised but alive, carrying Ethan in his arms. Their son clung tightly to him, visibly shaken but unharmed. Sarah collapsed into them, wrapping her arms around both as all 3 of them sobbed in relief. "You're safe," she whispered over and over, pressing kisses on Ethan's forehead. "You're safe." But as the family reunited, Lisa approached with a grim look. "We found them," she said, her tone heavy, "but Miranda's still out there. This isn't over." A stunning confession from the accomplice. The small, dimly lit interrogation room at the FBI field office in Dallas was a stark contrast to the sprawling, lavish estate of Miranda Cortez. The plain walls, the cold metallic table, and the single flickering fluorescent light above created an atmosphere designed for discomfort, and for breaking even the most hardened of criminals. Sitting across the table was Roy Callahan, his hands cuffed in front of him, his face streaked with sweat despite the air conditioning humming in the background. The man who once seemed untouchable, cocky, methodical, and fearless, now sat slouched, his confident demeanor eroded by hours of relentless questioning. His once pristine leather jacket was rumpled, his knuckles scabbed and bruised from being dragged down by the weight of his own secrets. Across from him sat Lisa Harrington. Her FBI badge lay conspicuously in the middle of the table, a subtle reminder of the authority she wielded. Lisa's sharp green eyes never wavered, boring into Callahan like a laser. She said nothing at first, letting the silence simmer, the kind of silence designed to make a guilty man's mind unravel. Roy shifted in his chair, the cuffs clinking as he adjusted his fingers nervously. He avoided her gaze, his eyes darting to the corners of the room as though some kind of salvation might materialize. It didn't. "You know how this goes, Roy," Lisa finally said in a calm but cutting voice, leaning forward as she placed her elbows on the table. "We're not leaving this room until you tell me everything. Every single detail." Roy smirked weakly, though his lips quivered slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the defeated tone in his voice betrayed him. He knew the net was closing in. Lisa let a small, cold smile creep onto her face. "You don't know what I'm talking about? Okay, let me remind you," she said, pulling out a small digital recorder and pressing play. The smoking gun. The room filled with scratchy audio, Roy's voice from a recently recorded conversation, detailing the planned abduction of Jonathan and Ethan Emerson. Every word was as damning as it was detailed. "You stick to the plan, you hear me?" the recording played. "We grab the man and the kid, make it quiet, make it fast, the message comes last, leave it with the wife, and make sure nobody talks. Nobody." As the recording ended, Lisa let the silence settle back into the room. She crossed her arms and studied Roy's reaction carefully. His smirk had disappeared entirely, replaced by something much closer to fear. "Sounds familiar, doesn't it?" Lisa asked. Her voice was calm, almost conversational, but it carried the weight of inevitability. "You wanted me to remind you what we're talking about, so there it is, straight from your mouth." Roy clenched his jaw tight, the muscles in his neck tensing as he fought to maintain any semblance of composure. "Look," he finally muttered, "what do you want from me? I've got nothing to say." Lisa leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled together. "You have everything to say. And let me tell you something, Roy. Miranda Cortez isn't coming to save you. She won't waste a cent, a whisper, or a second to keep you out of prison. You're disposable to her. Hell, I'd bet my badge she's already making sure you're the only name in this mess when it hits the courts." Roy's head dropped slightly, his greasy, unkempt hair falling over his face. He didn't respond immediately, but Lisa could see the cracks forming in his resolve. "You think Miranda cares about you? You're the hired help," Lisa continued, her tone growing more forceful. "She's sitting in her penthouse somewhere, sipping vodka and laughing at how easy it is to pin all this on you. Meanwhile, the kid you snatched is asking why he had to sleep in a cold warehouse and his father is bruised and battered because of you. Your fingerprints are all over this." She pointed harshly to the table between them. "You want to go down as her puppet, or as the man who finally had the guts to stand up to her?" The breaking point. The room went quiet again, save for the sound of Roy's shallow breathing. The tension in the room felt like it could snap at any moment. Lisa waited, her eyes locked on Roy's slumped form, willing him to crack. Finally, he let out a long, shaky exhale and raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale. "You don't get it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody says no to Miranda Cortez. You don't work for her, you survive her." Lisa leaned forward again, her expression a mix of curiosity and determination. "Then tell me what you know, Roy. Tell me how she got you into this. Tell me how she planned the kidnapping. Give me the truth, and maybe you can survive her too." Roy swallowed hard, licking his cracked lips before nodding hesitantly. "Fine," he said, his voice shaking, "but you have no idea what kind of monster you're dealing with." The confession. Over the next hour, Roy spilled the details. Everything from the initial job to the meticulous planning Miranda put into the abduction. According to him, it had been in the works for months. The financial collapse of Greenhaven was just the prelude to the real play, destroying Jonathan Emerson on every possible front. "She didn't just want his company," Roy explained, his hands trembling as he spoke. "She wanted him broken. She wanted his family broken. No loose ends, no redemption. This wasn't business, it was personal. She made that very clear." Lisa scribbled notes as Roy continued, his words coming faster and more desperate as he seemed to empty himself of the weight he'd been carrying. "She pulled strings with people high up, people who could freeze accounts, tie up suppliers, and make it look legit. But when Emerson wouldn't fold," Roy's voice trailed off for a moment. Then he swallowed hard and continued, "That's when she gave me the job. She said, take him, make it hurt, and make it loud enough that everyone gets the message." "And the boy," Lisa's voice was sharp, her pen frozen mid-note. Roy hesitated, guilt flashing across his face. That was a last-minute thing. She figured snatching the kid would put Emerson over the edge, make him do whatever she wanted. She didn't care if it scared him to death. Lisa's jaw tightened, her expression hardening as she processed his confession. "And the plan now? Where does Miranda think all this is leading?" Roy shook his head, his voice breaking. "She thinks she's untouchable. She thinks you'll never pin this on her. But if you've got me here, you might actually have a shot to stop her." Lisa stared at him for a long moment before rising from her chair. "You've done the right thing, Roy, but this is just the beginning. Miranda Cortez's empire is about to come crashing down." The first cracks in Miranda's shield. By the time Lisa left the interrogation room, she was armed with enough evidence to obtain warrants for Miranda's closest associates. The walls that Miranda had so carefully built around herself were beginning to crumble, and for the first time, Lisa felt they might have a chance to bring her down. In her office later that evening, Lisa dialed Sarah Emerson. "We've got our first confession," she said. "And it's damning. We're getting closer, Sarah." Sarah's grip tightened around the phone as she sat in the empty silence of her living room. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to hope. Not just that Jonathan and Ethan would be safe, but that Miranda Cortez might finally face the justice she deserved. But as Lisa ended the call and turned her attention back to the mounting case against Miranda, she couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. Miranda was a cornered predator now, and a predator was always most dangerous when it had nothing left to lose. The trial and the fall of power. The courthouse stood tall under the harsh Texas sun, its shadow long and looming like the weight of justice about to be delivered. Crowds had gathered outside, the air charged with anticipation and schadenfreude. Reporters jostled for position behind yellow police tape, their microphones raised high in hopes of catching a comment or reaction. The trial of Miranda Cortez had not just gripped Arlington or Dallas, it had captivated the nation. Once a figure of untouchable influence, Miranda was finally facing the reckoning she had long evaded. For years, she'd navigated boardrooms and backrooms with a predator's precision, leaving broken lives and wrecked reputations in her wake. Now, her own name, once whispered in boardroom corners with reverence and fear, was being shouted in headlines alongside words like crime boss, kidnapping conspirator, and master manipulator. As the courtroom doors swung open, she entered with her signature poise, her designer suit crisply tailored, every detail meticulously in place. But even the tailored blazer couldn't hide her exhaustion, or the way her gaze darted nervously across the room at the lawyers, reporters, and, most damning of all, the victims, Jonathan Emerson and his family. Opening arguments. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The high ceiling and polished wooden benches lent an air of solemn authority, but all eyes were on one person, Miranda Cortez. Sitting at the defendant's table, her once commanding presence seemed dimmed by the circumstances, her confidence reduced to an occasional flick of her perfectly manicured nails. The prosecutor, Angela McQueen, a rising star in the Justice Department, stepped forward to deliver the opening argument. She was sharp, commanding, and utterly unshaken. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice ringing clear across the room, "you are here today to bear witness to the fall of a woman who thought herself untouchable. Miranda Cortez wielded wealth and power not as tools for success, but as weapons to destroy anyone who stood in her way. Her crimes were not accidents. They were calculated, deliberate, and cruel." Angela's gaze swept across the jury, her tone growing sharper. "This is not a case of one misstep, one moment of weakness. This is a decades-long empire built on manipulation, intimidation, and yes, even violence. And at the center of it all, she used her influence to conspire in the abduction of Jonathan and Ethan Emerson, two innocent victims whose lives were forever changed." As Angela continued, Sarah Emerson held tightly to Jonathan's hand in the gallery. Ethan sat between them, too young to fully understand the scope of the trial but old enough to sense its importance. He glanced nervously at his parents, still haunted by memories of the black van, the warehouse, and the masked men who had ripped them from their lives. Evidence and testimony. The trial progressed into the second week, with the prosecution meticulously presenting its case. Photos of the kidnapping scene, maps linking Miranda's shadow network to Roy Callahan, and financial records that tied her directly to payments made to the hired abductors, all of it built a mountain of evidence that seemed insurmountable. But it wasn't the evidence itself that struck the hardest blow, it was the testimonies. Roy Callahan, the pawn who turned. When Roy Callahan took the stand, he was a shell of the man he had once been. Shackled, gaunt, and visibly broken, he glanced once at Miranda before quickly lowering his eyes. "Mr. Callahan," Angela McQueen began, stepping up to the witness stand, her voice firm, "you worked for Miranda Cortez on several operations over the past 5 years, is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Callahan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Speak up, Mr. Callahan," Angela said sharply. "The jury needs to hear every word." Roy straightened slightly, though his hands trembled. "Yes," he said, louder this time, "and was the kidnapping of Jonathan Emerson and his son, Ethan, one of those operations?" Angela pressed, her tone unrelenting. Roy hesitated, his gaze flicking toward Miranda, who sat impervious, refusing to meet his eyes. "Yes," he finally said. "What were Miss Cortez's instructions?" Angela asked. Roy exhaled shakily, running his cuffed hands through his hair. She told me to make it hurt. To take Jonathan and his kid. She wanted to send a message. To ruin him, make sure he knew not to mess with her. She said she wanted everyone to see what happens when you cross her." The jury murmured, shocked and appalled, as Angela pressed further. "Did she specify how this should be done?" "She didn't care how," Roy admitted, his voice heavy. "She just wanted it done, fast, loud, and messy." As Roy's testimony continued, Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Every word twisted the knife deeper for Jonathan, whose jaw clenched with barely contained rage. But for Miranda, the testimony seemed to bounce off her like raindrops on steel. Her expression remained stoic, her lips pressed into a tight line. Jonathan Emerson, the unbroken survivor. If Roy Callahan's testimony laid the foundation for the prosecution's case, Jonathan Emerson's testimony provided its beating heart. When Jonathan took the stand, there was an audible hush in the room. He sat stiffly, his eyes hollow from months of stress yet burning with quiet strength. As he recounted the events of the kidnapping, the terror of hearing his son cry, the cold isolation of the warehouse, the anger at being powerless to protect his family, each word resonated with raw emotion. "Mr. Emerson," Angela asked gently, "why didn't you concede to Miranda Cortez's demands when she pressured you?" Jonathan blinked, his lips tightening. "Because what she wanted wasn't just my company," he said, his voice steady but laced with pain. "She wanted my integrity. She wanted me to betray everything I stood for. I couldn't do that. Not for her, not for anyone." "And what did that cost you?" Angela asked. Jonathan paused, glancing at Sarah and Ethan in the gallery before meeting Angela's gaze. "Everything. It cost me everything. My reputation, my business, and almost my family." The defense's desperation. Miranda's defense team tried valiantly to sow doubt in the minds of the jurors. They claimed Callahan was an unreliable witness, a criminal trying to save his own skin. They argued that the blurry financial trails tying Miranda to the payments were circumstantial. They even suggested that Miranda's enemies might have framed her for the kidnapping. But as the evidence piled up, their attempts grew more desperate. Miranda herself never took the stand, a decision that only added to the perception of her guilt. The woman who had spent her life commanding rooms and controlling people now sat silent and powerless, a faint shadow of the person she once was. The verdict. After weeks of gripping testimony, closing arguments, and intense deliberation, the jury finally returned with their verdict. The judge spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of justice. "On the charges of conspiracy to commit kidnapping, conspiracy to commit fraud, and engaging in organized crime, we find the defendant, Miranda Cortez, guilty on all counts." The room erupted. Reporters scrambled for their cameras, a wave of noise drowning out Miranda's pale, stunned expression. For the first time in years, possibly decades, she looked shaken. No more masks, no more poise. Just a woman caught in the web of her own creation. The fall of power. As Miranda was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the courtroom felt like it had exhaled all the tension it had held for weeks. For Jonathan and Sarah Emerson, it was not a moment of triumph, but of bittersweet relief. The damage Miranda had inflicted couldn't simply be undone, but for the first time, they felt the weight of her shadow lifting. Outside the courthouse, Angela McQueen faced the press, her tone resolute as she declared, "Today's verdict proves that no one, no matter how rich, no matter how powerful, is above the law." Miranda Cortez's fall from grace sent shockwaves through Texas's elite circles. Her empire of influence crumbled almost overnight, her allies scattering like rats abandoning a sinking ship. And for the Emerson family, justice had been served, not perfectly, not without scars, but served nonetheless. A cautionary tale from the shadows. Miranda Cortez had fallen. The empire she had meticulously built, an empire forged from manipulation, intimidation, and sheer force of will, had crumbled like a house of cards. But even as she sat, defeated and forgotten, in a cold prison cell deep in the outskirts of Texas, the echoes of her reign continued to reverberate through the lives of everyone she had touched, and through the halls of power she had once dominated. The courtroom drama was over, the news headlines had petered out, and the public had slowly moved on to other scandals, other dramas. But for those who were consumed in the eye of Miranda Cortez's storm, the aftermath was far from over. It was more than a trial, more than a downfall. It was a lesson, one that could not be ignored. Even as the dust settled, many were left pondering. How had someone like Miranda Cortez risen so far, and how had she fallen so hard? The answers weren't simple. They never were. But the story she left in her wake became something more. A cautionary tale, a grim reminder of the cost of unchecked ambition, of power wielded without humanity. The shadow of power. There was something intoxicating about Miranda Cortez's power. For years she had shown the world that with enough influence, enough connections, and enough ruthlessness, you could control almost anything. Laws became mere suggestions for her. People, pawns in the game, everyone had a price, and for those who didn't, Miranda found other ways to bend them. Her ascent was relentless, but her methods came with a steep price. Her fall revealed the truth buried beneath decades of triumphs. Miranda's success was hollow. The wealth, the mansions, the reputation, none of it was real. It was an illusion carefully crafted with lies, fear, and manipulation. The Emerson family became the light that exposed Miranda's shadow. Jonathan, Sarah, and Ethan's tenacity, their refusal to abandon each other or their values, stood in stark contrast to Miranda's relentless pursuit of dominance. They became a symbol of something Miranda had long forgotten: love, integrity, and the strength to resist oppression. "I thought power would make me untouchable," Miranda had said during her last interview before sentencing. "I thought I could rewrite the rules, but the truth is, no one is untouchable. Not really. The Emersons. A story of survival. The Emerson family's story didn't end in the courtroom. While the trial brought closure, it didn't erase the trauma they endured or the scars they carried. Jonathan had lost nearly everything: his business, his reputation, his peace of mind, but he had kept his family, and in the end, that was all he needed. For Sarah and Ethan, the nightmare of Miranda's wrath left marks they couldn't yet put into words. Returning to normal life wasn't an immediate option, but they clung to each other in healing. In the months following Miranda's fall, Jonathan began to rebuild. Greenhaven agriculture, though battered, wasn't beyond saving. The community of Arlington rallied behind him like never before, farmers and customers determined to see Greenhaven rise again. For years Jonathan had operated quietly, making his company a symbol of sustainability. Now, it became something more, a symbol of resilience. Greenhaven, Jonathan told a local reporter during their first public interview since the ordeal, was never about me. It was about doing what was right, being stewards to the earth and to the people who trust us. That ideal, it's still alive. The Emersons faced a long road ahead, but their strength lay in their unity. They had withstood the worst Miranda Cortez had to offer and emerged intact. Bruised, yes, but not broken. If there was one thing Jonathan and Sarah hoped to teach Ethan, it was that no amount of power or money could ever substitute for character. Lessons learned. But the story of Miranda Cortez wasn't just about one family or one town. Hers was a cautionary tale of a system that enabled her, of a world that glorified power at any cost. For years Miranda had thrived in the shadows, using the loopholes, exploiting the blind spots, and she wasn't the only one. Miranda Cortez wasn't born a monster, she had become one, molded by a society that rewarded ambition without accountability. People like Miranda Cortez exist because systems let them. Angela McQueen, the prosecutor from the trial, told a room of law students after the verdict, "Justice doesn't just happen, it has to be fought for, not just in courtrooms but in every corner of society." The warning her story gives us isn't just about her, it's about us. The trial didn't just bring Miranda down, it shone a light on the fragility of ethics in high places. Politicians started pushing for new legislation to address corporate corruption. Businesses distanced themselves from the shadowy practices Miranda had normalized. And while the change wasn't immediate or universal, her downfall had begun a conversation, one that couldn't be ignored. "We have to ask ourselves," Angela continued, "how much longer we'll let ambition blind us? Because if there's one thing Miranda Cortez showed the world, it's this: power without humanity is poison." Ethan Emerson's reflection. 5 years later, after time coaxed the Emerson family toward some semblance of peace, it was Ethan who offered the most poignant reflection. Now a teenager, Ethan had written a school essay titled, "When the World Goes Dark." In it, he shared his memories of the ordeal, not the violence or the terror, but the lessons he had learned about courage and hope. "My dad always told me that storms don't last forever," Ethan wrote. "He used to say that no matter how strong they seem, they always pass, and what matters is how we grow after they're gone." Miranda Cortez was a storm, and for a long time it felt like she would never stop, but she did. And when the storm ended, I realized my mom, my dad, and I weren't as broken as I thought. We were still standing. Ethan's words echoed something universal: resilience in the face of darkness, the power of hope when everything feels lost. It was a simple essay, but it resonated. His teacher shared it at a school assembly. From there, it circulated on social media, eventually becoming a viral sensation, a lasting legacy. Miranda Cortez's story didn't fade, it transformed. Her name became synonymous with corruption, greed, and the ultimate cost of unchecked ambition. But alongside her story lived the story of the Emersons. Where Miranda symbolized the dark depths of power, the Emersons became a beacon of resilience, community, and the unyielding strength of human connection. And so, long after Miranda's prison gates clanged shut, long after the courtroom crowds dissipated, her story endured as a cautionary tale. It spoke not only to the consequences of greed but also to the triumph of ordinary people standing against it. Power could wreak havoc, yes, but it could not erase courage or integrity. The world, it seemed, had learned one undeniable truth from the shadows Miranda Cortez had left behind. No empire, no matter how mighty, how cruel, or how carefully constructed, could withstand the light of justice forever.